Hi, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about naming things and not naming things like places or names of characters, but actually naming things like for my game, which I'm working on. I've been having this problem where I couldn't quite get the feeling of one of the classes just right, and it took me a while to figure out what the problem was until I realized it just had the wrong name. I'd been calling it one thing, and then I changed the name to another thing, and like that, all the problems were gone, and I had no inspiration, and I was able to work through all of the problems I had in about 30 minutes. So to get to that, I'll give a quick overview of what's going on in my game and how it works, so you'll see where all of this fits. So this game is set in a kind of post-apocalyptic world where essentially society has had its whole destruction, downfall, and then a lot of time has passed. People have come out of hiding or survival mode and are back into like building mode, but very early into those stages. And they've got a lot of technology from the old world, which they're using to power up the construction of the new world, essentially. And there's a lot of forces at play, a lot of forces from the old world, a lot of things that change in between. It's essentially fantasy elements sneak into the game, but it's mostly just kind of um oh well, I mean it's a fantasy game, so when I say fantasy elements stick into the game, you can think of it as a real world game with fantasy elements in it. So it's very grounded. It's got a lot of like things that you would see in the modern 21st century, but goblins and ghouls and ghosts and all of those things are very real and out there gonna get you essentially. So I have 10 classes in the game. I had 8 classes, I added 2 recently, and 9 out of those 10 worked almost immediately for me. The vibe was right, the flavor was right, they worked exactly how I wanted them to, except from one archetype. So a lot of things to introduce real quickly, so I'll just try to get as much of it done as possible. Um, I have 10 classes, each class has 3 archetypes, which are essentially subclasses if you're familiar with like D&D 5e. Um, each class has its own distinct fantasy that I'm trying to get, and I'll make a video about your fantasy and your design principles and stuff like that next, ideally. But essentially, I wanted each class to have a flavor, a certain fantasy that it draws upon, and I want you to feel that fantasy when you're playing that class. And then there are 3 archetypes that delve further into that class fantasy. So if your class fantasy is kind of being a mobile striker, then you could be, how are you mobile? How are you getting in and out of strikes? What kind of strikes are you doing? Are you better at striking because you're mobile, or does being mobile get you out of danger? Is it a survival thing, or does it make you stronger? Essentially, that's where the archetype kind of comes into the flavor of things. Um, so I had 10 classes, and I'll go through all of them, and I'll leave the one that was giving me a lot of challenges for later. So the first archetype is the animist. That's one of the new classes I was working on. It's the most recent one, and it essentially works with like nature spirits and things like that. So, um, if you imagine like essentially in D&D terms, for example, in 5e terms, this is somewhere in an overlap between the cleric and the druid, with some ranger-ish vibes in there. So they've got things like spirit companions and find familiar, but they've also got things like wild shapes and entangling vines and things like that. So very much got that kind of naturey feeling, but also like spiritual feeling to things. And then the next class is the brute, which, and so with the animes, for example, I was very happy with it right off the bat. Like I introduced it, and as soon as I did, I was like, yes, this is right. This fits perfectly to this world. This works exactly how I want it to, because the name animist worked so well for what it was. A spiritually connected class, animism, makes perfect sense. In touch with the spirits of everything in the world, makes perfect sense to me anyway. If it plays out like that in um playtests and things like that, then perfectly happy. If not, then I'm happy to tweak things. But I think the vibe and the flavor are already in there and they're already quite good. The second class is the Brute, which again works exactly how you would think a Brute works. They're essentially like the barbarians of D&D 5e. They frontline tanking, dealing a lot of damage kind of thing. They aren't very mobile. They aren't meant to do a lot of flexible things, but they are good at what they do, which is hitting things and moving things around. Then you have the Elementalist. This is the equivalent of kind of your wizards and your sorcerers in D&D 5e. They control the elements as you would imagine. And this is an example of when, even though the words are specific and mean one thing, you can use them to mean another thing and it would work just fine because they have your classic elements. They use their three archetypes, and the three archetypes are three different elements. So you have fire, ice, and earth. But with earth, I've added poison and I've added acid, which are not elements, at least not in the classical sense or in the modern sense. It's not earth, air, fire, water, but that kind of fits into the vibe of an elementalist, right? It doesn't take you out of the fantasy if someone who has a lot of elemental abilities also creates poison gas, for example, right? It feels right, at least for me. So I was happy with that. And that didn't break the fantasy for me, even though the naming and the actual abilities weren't quite right. The vibe was still the same, and that's because the naming and the fantasy you conjure up when you think of an elementalist, I think it's strong enough that it includes acid and poison. But yeah, they're essentially like D&D wizards. They have elemental abilities. And then you have the engineer, which is an entirely new class. They don't really fit into like the D&D structure because, like I said, this world is quite modern. They've got firearms and things like that. So the engineer is more along the lines of, well, the engineer from like TF2 or Torbjorn from Overwatch, for example. Their whole thing is, or the support classes in XCOM. Their whole thing is, you know, area of AOE damage, AOE control, and kind of flexible movement, healing from afar kind of thing. They have drones, they have turrets, they have abilities to make everyone's weapons better. They have many ways of blowing things up. And that I think is in the fantasy of an engineer in this kind of games. It's, a lot of blowing things up and a lot of helping people deal more damage, AoE kind of attacks. So that works for me, even though, real world engineers aren't exactly going around blowing everything up, at least. I don't think they are. Um, and then next you have the Mystic. And the Mystic is another one that feels right, even though there isn't like a direct, well, there is. It's does what I feel like it should do. The name inspires a vision in your head, I think. And I think the Mystic does that just right. The Mystic is one of two classes that actually breaks like the player character divide in my game, because in my game, characters have abilities based on their deck of cards, and your card is essentially what you can do, what abilities you have. So if your card says, for example, you get to deal this much damage, and you get to deal this much damage if you can play the card. Mystics are one of the few classes that actually break that divide and have and affect what the player can do, not what the character can do. So most classes have this character can deploy a bomb that deals this much damage and this much in this range or whatever. The Mystic, however, has an ability, or some Mystics anyway, have the ability to actually change what cards you have in your hand as the player, not as the character. And between the game and the interface between the player and the character is interesting to me. I think it's fun to play with. But it's, in the game, it's kind of having this ability to see alternate possibilities and essentially change the the fabric of the universe essentially and bend it to your will. And that's what the Mystic is all about. The Mystic is about channeling the void glow energy, which is what the ancient energy that powers everything essentially. It's kind of a force that flows through everything. It's the ether. And they have this natural connection to it that lets them, see the future or see alternate possibilities, or just do things like blow everyone up. They also have basic attacks that, just deal a lot of damage. Well, not a lot of damage, relatively speaking. Quite low damage because they're quite powerful otherwise. But I think that's quite mystical, right? When you hit the mystic, you think, oh, they've got to be able to do things like exactly what they do, mystical stuff. Um, so that's the mystic, and then you've got the scout. And the scout does, again, in my opinion, what I think a scout should do. They get in, they deal damage quickly, and then they move out. They're very mobile class. They have the most movement of any class in the game, and they are good at not getting hit with reactions, for example. So they're meant to be a mobile class that gets in, deals damage, gets out. And the way they do that is different. So there are different classes that have different ways of doing that. And I think that's these are different archetypes that have different ways of doing that. And I think that's what makes it really interesting because you can have different scouts that have different playing styles. And I'll go through like examples of these later in this video. But yeah, the scout's whole thing is being a mobile hitter, getting in, getting out, dealing damage, melee kind of class. Um, and then we have the sharpshooter, another class that does exactly what you think it does. Stays in the back, deals a lot of damage if it has time and positioning right, but otherwise is quite average. They're not meant. They have relatively low hit points compared to everyone else, but they deal a lot of damage if they can set up a shot. Essentially, I think they have by far the highest potential of damage output per round, but it takes a lot of setting up and a lot of sacrifices. They essentially sacrifice their movement and they sacrifice a lot of things. They have to be just right and be at the right position. They're one of the few long range um classes in the game, so they have to be quite far away, which means if you close up on them, they become quite useless. And in close quarters, they are not as effective. But given their perfect optimal location and positioning, they will they have the potential to end the game in one round. So they're quite powerful like that. And I think that's very thematic of the sharpshooter. When you think of the sharpshooter, you think, oh, they stay far away and they time their shot to perfection and all of that. That's what I think. That's what they're trying to go for. That's what I'm trying to go for, and that's what they do. Next, you've got the soldier. The soldier is essentially your generic fighter equivalent in D&D. They deal damage. They are consistent. They have ways of keeping themselves alive. They have ways of keeping the fight going, and they deal a in a significant amount of damage. I think outside of like the brute, the class I'm going to talk about later, and the sharpshooter, the soldier is the most consistent damage dealer because that's what they do. That is essentially all they're there for, is to be consistent and to deal damage, which I think is in the vibe of when you think generic soldier, then that is kind of like the generic fighter in D&D. They're just there to do the basic thing well, and that's what the soldier does, in my opinion. And finally, we have the strategist. The strategist is similar to like the warlord in fourth edition. They are the other class that have the ability to break the interface between the player and um the character and the player, and they do that and for them that's more about like changing the order of cards you can play, or bringing in cards that you didn't have already set up. So you have your deck, your card pool, which is all the cards your character knows, and at the start of the day you choose your deck, which is all the cards you can use that day, and then you get your hand. And the strategist plays between the interface between the deck pool, the deck, and the hand. Whereas Mystic plays between like cards you've already played, cards you haven't played yet, and where cards are located in the deck. The strategist is kind of like a bardic role. They have auras like the paladin, so auras of healing, auras of inspiration, but they otherwise are just there for like classic buff style abilities. Make everyone else hit good. They don't have the highest survivability, they don't have the best damage, but played well, they can change the game by helping the allies deal a lot more damage and live a lot longer. So all of these classes I was very happy with. One of the early problems I had was one of the archetypes, the brute archetypes. There are three brute archetypes. I have the executioner, whose whole thing is it gets more deadly the lower hit points the enemy has. And because I'm trying to keep the game simple, the mechanics are really simple. It's just if the enemy has less than 50 hit points, they have the ability to deal more damage. And then you have the Juggernaut, whose whole thing is movement and breaking into like enemy lines and moving enemies around and just kind of um frontline disruption, mobility, moving everyone around, setting up other people's shots or triggering other people's reactions and things like that. And then there was a third class which I called at the time when I started working on this, the Unstoppable. And the Unstoppable thing was meant to be essentially the opposite, kind of like a mirror of the Executioner, where the Executioner gets more powerful and more deadly the lower hit points you have. The Unstoppable gets more powerful and more and does a lot more damage. The more hot damage it is taken. So the lower they have, the lower their hit points is, and in this case, again, keeping it simple, if they're below 50% hit points, they deal more damage. They have the ability to deal more damage with if they get the right cards, if they get the right position in, but they have the ability to deal a lot more damage the lower hit points they have. But the name Unstoppable didn't quite work because the Juggernaut has that whole thing about moving people around. The Unstoppable didn't. And there's a fighter class called the Bulwark, which has the opposite thing where it cannot be moved. It's about breaking front lines like the Juggernaut, but it's about, it charges a lot, but also it's resistant to being tripped, it's resistant to being pushed or pulled and stuff like that. So those two classes were a lot closer to what I would call unstoppable in terms of just momentum, in terms of physical movement, than the Unstoppable, which was unstoppable in sense of they will take a lot of damage before going down. They will keep going, essentially. They are resilient. And that was a problem. And it was pointed out to me first by one of my friends who, when I told him I was doing this, and he just went through the classes and the archetypes, and he pointed that one out and was like, that doesn't work. That's not what I think of when I think of Unstoppable. This is not doing what you think it's meant to be doing. And he was exactly right. He was perfectly right. So I thought about it for a bit and I changed the name and I changed it to the Indomitable, which I think is a lot more true. It's indomitable. It will not be defeated. And that's what the class is meant to be, and that's what the vibe of the class is meant to be. So I'll go through. I printed out the first version of the book. It's not perfect. I have a bunch of pages missing. The printer misprinted a bunch of them. But I'll just give you like an example of the brute. I don't know how well this is coming through. So we have the brute, and that's just like a description of what the brute does. And you have the three classes and their bonuses. I will have an example. I will have a copy of this somewhere to be downloaded if you want it for free, obviously. Just if you want to have a look at what the classes do. If you have any notes, I'm happy to hear them. Leave them in the comments or something. I will read through all of them and let you know. But let's see. Let's look for another class and examples of what they do. Yeah, the Mystic. So we've got the Mystic here. And here's what they do. Here's the first Mystic archetype, the Channeler. And the Channeler's whole thing is they're a damage dealing Mystic, essentially. They're good at controlling and doing powerful bursts of energy, essentially. The Seer is about time manipulation, so they're the ones who let you move things around in your deck and things like that. And the Warden, both of which are on the other end of the page. And the Warden, which is more of a defensive Mystic, so they have things like shields and abilities to heal and keep their allies alive, essentially. So that's what I meant when I meant like the classes have different archetypes and the archetypes change the flavor of it, because all three of them I think are quite mystic in the way they play. One of them just like, a kind of like a warlock style of massive arcane damage. One of them is just a time manipulating guy, and the third one is like a defensive cleric kind of play style. But all of them conjure that same vision. Which brings me to the class I was having problem with. And before I fixed it, it was called the Rogue. And that did not work. The problem, I didn't know what the problem was for a while. I just knew that I was struggling with the Rogue class. And specifically the overlap between the Rogue and the Scout. The word rogue in fantasy role playing games is very loaded. It has like it conjures its own style of play, and the rogue in my game did not have that style of play. I couldn't figure out if it should be a melee class or a short range class, for example. I couldn't figure out. Let's talk about the ranges real quick. I have it. I'll see if I can find it. Yep. So there are four main designations of range. There are four main classes of range, essentially. There's melee. Can see. There's melee where you have 2 to 5, 1 to 2 meters. There's short range where there's 2 to 7 meters. There's medium range where there's 5 to 15, and there's long range which is 10 to 30. It's not long range isn't that long, but it's long enough, I think. But yeah, so that was a problem I was having. I didn't know where the rogue should be. Should it be in melee? Should it be in short range? I didn't know how much damage they should do, how they should deal damage. I didn't know what kind of attacks they should have. Um, I just didn't know a lot about what the rogue should be because the playstyle didn't really work. It had a lot of overlap and they had a lot of cards similar to the scout, and I couldn't figure that out because no other class really had that. There's only two other classes that have an overlap, and that's one card that's shared between the engineer and the strategist, and that I'm perfectly happy with. It's adrenaline. It gives you more AP. Essentially, AP is what you need to play cards. I'm happy with both of them having that because it's flavorful for both of them. But with the scout and the rogue, they both had sneak attack. They both had a trip attack. They both had a throwing weapon thing attack, and the overlap was just too similar for me. And that's because I couldn't figure out what the rogue was. I knew what I wanted the scout to be. I was perfectly happy with the scout, but I couldn't figure out the rogue because when I think rogue, I think of the D&D rogue. I think of the the rogue archetype you think of when you think fantasy, right? And this my rogue just didn't play that way. They didn't hit and run, which is the classic thing of I hit, I hide. I hit, I move, I hide. Kind of that's the play style of like a rogue classically in D&D 5e, right? And this class doesn't do that. This class hits and stays there and hits again and again and again and again and again. And that's what they do. They hit a lot. They hit a lot more than any other class. And they hit a lot more frequently than any other class. They deal damage in a different way. So the sharpshooter deals a lot of damage by dealing large bursts of damage. The rogue class deals damage by, nipping in ears, a little damage here, a little damage there, which adds up over time to a lot of damage. They deal the most damage, but they have the most attacks, but each attack deals less damage than the other classes, than any other class. So I couldn't figure out what to call them until the other day when I was, putting this together, and I was like, okay, I need to solve this rogue problem, or I need to get rid of this rogue class. And I just sat there for like 2 hours thinking about what to do because I quite well. First, I like the idea of there being an even number of classes. I had 8. I was happy with 8, and then I moved up to 10, and I'm happy with 10. I wasn't sure I was gonna be happy with 9 classes. It just doesn't feel right, and I didn't want to put in another class that I didn't have the fantasy for yet. Just shoehorn in it to make a complete 10th class. So I wasn't happy with deleting the class. Now, I understand. I know that I might have to delete classes here or change classes around, and that's fine. That's game design. I'm not gonna feel good about it, but I know I would have to do it, and when I have to do it, I will do it. I was gonna if I had to do it with the rogue, I was gonna do it. I just wouldn't have felt good about it. But then I had a breakthrough essentially, where I just thought, well, it's not playing like a rogue because it's not a rogue. It's not a rogue class. There's nothing. Well, it's roguish, but it's not the classic rogue. It's like an archetype of rogue, yes. but it's not the main fantasy you think of when you think of rogues in fantasy. So I changed the name and I changed it to the Duellist, and that solved everything. Because a Duellist is simplified. It tells you exactly what it does. It's about being a good striker. It's about getting into duels and winning duels essentially with precision. And I'm like, this is perfect. This is exactly what I wanted. And once I had that, I was ecstatic essentially. It took me from getting that point to completing the class design. That meant getting rid of a lot of the old card abilities that it had and creating new ones. And being like, oh, what ability would feel good with this class? Well, combo attacks and chain attacks and this attack and this ability to not get hit all came together all so quickly once I realized they're not a rogue, they're a duelist. So I'm gonna open the class and just show you what I have for the Duellist now. Uh, and this should be available somewhere online if I can figure it out early. If not, I'll try to get it up as soon as I can. But yeah, the three archetypes here: the assassin, which is a holdover from the roguish days, but I think it's fine. I think it works just as fine as any other class. And then you have the swashbuckler, which is perfect, and the trickster, which is perfect as well. And by changing the name, everything just kind of worked well. So, yeah, I just wanted to talk about that. I guess I was feeling quite good about it, feeling quite good about having this completed and ready to go. It's called Void Glow. That's the name of the element that kind of channels everything that powers all the magic tech in the world. I'm not married to the name. I'll be honest. This is another one like the rogue where I'm happy with it now, but I don't know how permanent that's gonna be. If you have any suggestions, let me know. I had Aetherist at some point, but I got rid of that one. I have Void Glow now. We'll see how I feel about that. I'm gonna talk to people about it. I'm gonna play playtest session in a few weeks, and I'll see how my players feel about that, and then we'll go from there. But yeah, I'm just gonna show you some of the cards. So these are the general cards. These are the cards that everyone gets access to from the first round. And, you can... That's really reflective. I apologize. But essentially, you get your basic things, your aid, your aim. You get dash, dodge, a bit of healing. And then let's look at the brutes cards, for example. The brute. Let's look for a card at the page that's more legible, I think. Duellist, is this better? Yes, this is better. So this is the Duellist, and these are some of the abilities that the Duellist gets. I'll just put a picture. I realize I have the PDF form of this, so I'll just put that up instead. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful to someone, or at least interesting to someone. It's just, it's what was going on my mind. It's what's been top of brain right now. I'm going to do a video on game design philosophy and about finding that fantasy that you're trying to get through in your game and having that trickle down through everything. And yeah, so if you're interested in that, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll get back to you with a new video, hopefully this week or next. Yeah, I promised in the last video, I promised a video on creating a language, but I did that and it was honestly quite boring. I was interested. I thought the languages I came up with were interesting, but I don't know that the process will be interesting to tell you retrospectively. So I think what I'm gonna do at some point is, because there's still more languages I need to work on, so I'm just gonna do that on camera, record the whole process, and then put that up instead, if that's more interesting. If not, then I'll discuss creating a language at some point. But it's gonna happen. It's just the way I did it last time was not interesting at all for me, and I didn't imagine it would be for you guys, so I scrapped that. So yeah, thanks for watching this video. If you stayed to the end, I'm glad this was interesting or entertaining or something to you. See you next time.